The doctor's words echoed through the wide halls of the Harrington estate like a final verdict. Isabella Harrington had no more than 2 months left to live. Her husband, Edward Harrington, one of the wealthiest men in the country, stood frozen as if struck down in the boardroom of his life. For decades he had bent markets to his will, signed contracts worth billions, and faced rivals without flinching. But now, in his own home, he was staring down an enemy that no contract, no merger, no empire could defeat. Isabella lay in a room lined with imported silks, soft drapes, and polished marble floors. Yet all that wealth did nothing to hide the fragility of her body. Once full of life and grace, she now seemed weighed down by invisible chains. Each breath came with effort, her eyes dimming as though her spirit had already started to leave. Edward refused to surrender. He poured money into every possible cure. Private jets carried her to world-class hospitals, where specialists from across continents examined her case. Laboratories tested experimental drugs flown in at enormous cost. He hired entire teams of nutritionists, therapists, and consultants. Some treatments gave hope for days, but nothing truly changed. Isabella remained trapped in the same slow decline. The mansion, once a place of laughter and extravagant gatherings, transformed into a hollow shell. Staff tiptoed through corridors, their footsteps echoing against silence. No one dared to mention Isabella's condition openly. It felt forbidden, as if words themselves could push her further toward the end. Every morning Edward appeared in her room, his tailored suits wrinkled, his once sharp posture slouched by sleepless nights. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand, whispering promises that money would find the answer. But with each passing day, the weight of failure pressed heavier against him. Those who worked under the Harrington roof often exchanged quiet glances, but none had the courage to say what they were thinking. The air in the mansion grew thick with fear, resignation, and whispers that death was inevitable. Yet one question seemed to linger in the background, unspoken. What if Isabella's condition was not what it appeared to be? Because sometimes, the most dangerous illnesses aren't found in medical reports. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to Souls and Riches Stories channel, and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. We love seeing where our stories travel across the world. Now, back to the Harrington estate. Edward's grief turned him into a recluse. The empire he built ran itself while he remained locked inside the mansion. A man obsessed only with the fading woman in the upstairs bedroom. And though he would never admit it, there were moments in the quiet of night when he questioned not only fate, but also the people around him. Nurses came and went, hired at exorbitant rates, but leaving without warning. Each time Edward asked why, he was given polite excuses. Better opportunities, family obligations, exhaustion from the demanding job. Still, a subtle pattern lingered. Staff didn't stay long in that house. The Harrington estate grew quieter with every departure, until only a handful of servants remained. They avoided Edward's eyes, as though they knew something but lacked the courage to speak. It was in this atmosphere of despair that a new maid arrived. Her name was Elena. She was neither glamorous nor impressive in appearance. To most, she seemed ordinary, a woman hired to sweep floors and change sheets. She kept her head down, spoke little, and blended into the mansion's silence. But Elena possessed something that others lacked. She noticed details. The way Isabella's face tensed after certain meals. The faint marks on her arms that didn't look like simple injections. The unusual stillness in Edward's office whenever medical charts were brought in. No one else paid attention. No one else dared to ask questions. Yet Elena did. And one night, as the rain tapped softly against the high windows, she stumbled across something inside that mansion that made her blood run cold. The Harrington story was about to change forever, because the truth was nothing like the diagnosis. Edward Harrington had built his empire brick by brick, with deals sealed in boardrooms across the globe. His name carried weight on Wall Street. His signature could sway markets, and his instincts were once described as flawless. Yet now, seated in his vast library, the firelight barely reaching his face, he looked nothing like the man who once terrified competitors. He was diminished, as if his power had been stripped away piece by piece. The empire continued to run, but not because of him. A network of executives and managers kept the businesses moving, though quietly they whispered about their absent chairman. Edward hadn't attended a board meeting in over a year. Reports were delivered to his desk, but most remained unopened. The stock price fluctuated, the media speculated, but he no longer cared. His fortune was intact, but his world revolved around one fading figure, Isabella. The mansion became both sanctuary and prison. Days began and ended in the same way. Edward by Isabella's side, her fragile hand in his. He tracked her meals, her medications, and her breathing with the precision of a man desperate for control in a situation where control no longer existed. His assistant suggested he take time to rest, but he waved them off. To him, rest felt like surrender. At night, when silence pressed hardest, his mind drifted back to the days before wealth had insulated them from the world. He could still see Isabella as she was the first time they met, a girl from a small coastal town, her laughter brighter than anything money could buy. She worked in a modest cafe, and he was just a young man with dreams too big for his wallet. She had believed in him before the world knew his name. They had nothing then, just late-night walks and shared promises whispered over chipped coffee mugs. She encouraged him to keep pushing when deals collapsed, when loans were denied, when he thought the dream was slipping away. With Isabella at his side, he discovered a strength no balance sheet could measure. She wasn't impressed by ambition or luxury. She was impressed by effort, by the way he kept getting back up when the world told him to stay down. Years passed, and those promises turned into reality. Edward secured his first major investment, then another. Soon, his company spread across industries, real estate, technology, shipping, and finance. And through every triumph, Isabella remained the quiet anchor behind the empire. She never sought the spotlight. Her joy was in the private moments, celebrating birthdays with handwritten notes, reminding him of the values they began with, grounding him when success threatened to harden him. Now, as Edward watched her slip further away each day, he felt powerless for the first time in his life. Contracts could be renegotiated, lawsuits settled, rivals defeated. But this? No amount of money or influence bent the course of her illness. His billions bought access, but they could not buy time. Every hallway of the mansion reminded him of their shared story, laughter echoing from staircases, music playing during impromptu gatherings, the warmth of her smile when he returned from long trips. Now those echoes only deepened the emptiness. Edward, the man who had outlasted storms in business, now faced a battle he couldn't win. And though he never admitted it aloud, the thought that haunted him most was simple and cruel. For all his wealth and power, he might lose the only thing that ever truly mattered. When Elena Alvarez arrived at the Harrington estate, she did not look like someone who could change the fate of a billionaire's household. She carried no air of importance, no confidence that demanded attention. Her clothes were simple, her voice soft, and her manner so unobtrusive that most of the staff barely noticed her presence at first. To them, she was just another maid who would come and go, like so many before her. But Elena was not there for prestige or steady pay. She was there because she needed escape. Only months earlier, tragedy had struck her life with merciless force. She had lost her newborn child during delivery. And with that loss came a silence she could not bear. Her apartment became unbearable, every corner reminding her of what she no longer had. When the opportunity arose to work far from that pain, in a house that asked only for quiet duties and long hours, she took it without hesitation. The Harrington mansion was intimidating to many who entered it. Gilded staircases, marble floors, chandeliers dripping with crystals, symbols of wealth that dazzled at first sight. But to Elena, the grandeur only deepened the hollowness she sensed within. The staff whispered that the house felt heavy, not because of its size, but because of what lingered inside. Most avoided long conversations, preferring to finish their duties quickly and vanish into the background. Elena, however, carried silence inside her already. She was used to it, and in some strange way, she belonged in this place of muted voices. Her first days were uneventful. She dusted the library shelves, polished the silver, and straightened rooms that no one used anymore. Unlike others, she did not complain about the strict routine or Edward's unspoken rules. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and moved with quiet efficiency. The other staff dismissed her with shrugs. "She won't last," they whispered. "No one ever does." But Elena was different. She did not seek escape through resignation. She sought meaning through observation. And from the moment she caught sight of Isabella Harrington, she felt a strange pull. Isabella lay in her bed, frail and pale, her once celebrated beauty reduced to fragile outlines. To the untrained eye, she looked like a woman being consumed by an illness too powerful to fight. Yet to Elena, who had spent nights watching her own child fight for breath, something about Isabella's condition didn't match the stories told around her. She noticed that Isabella's reactions were inconsistent. Some mornings she seemed to weaken suddenly after meals, her eyes clouding over with a wariness that didn't look natural. On other days she seemed slightly stronger, only to fade again within hours. Elena also caught sight of faint bruises on her arms, small but numerous, as though injections had been more frequent than necessary. The staff explained it away as the routine of treatment, but Elena's instincts told her otherwise. She didn't voice her suspicions, she simply watched, listened, and kept notes in her mind. Her grief had taught her to pay attention to details others ignored. And while most servants walked past Isabella with pity, Elena lingered with a different gaze, one that sought truth rather than resignation. No one else noticed. No one else cared to question. But in the quiet corners of the Harrington mansion, Elena began to sense that Isabella's illness might not be what the doctors had declared. And that realization, faint and fragile as it was, would soon ignite a chain of discoveries no one could have imagined. Elena's role in the Harrington mansion was simple: clean the rooms, serve when called, and keep her head low. But as the days passed, her eyes kept drifting toward Isabella, and what she saw did not sit right with her. At first, she told herself it was none of her concern. Billionaires lived in a world far removed from hers, a world where choices were made in whispers and signed on paper, worth more than she'd ever see. But Isabella wasn't just a wealthy man's wife wasting away. She was a woman whose suffering carried strange inconsistencies that refused to be ignored. Meals became the first clue. Elena noticed that Isabella's strength varied, not by time of day or dosage of medicine, but by who prepared the food. When certain staff brought trays, soups, porridges, carefully portioned vegetables, Isabella would grow pale within minutes, her breathing uneven, her eyelids too heavy to lift. Yet when Elena managed to slip in something simple she had made herself, tea with honey, bread toasted lightly, Isabella's decline was less immediate. She still looked weak, but her color held longer, her breath steadier. It was a detail dismissed by others as coincidence. To Elena, it was a pattern. The second detail revealed itself in Isabella's arms. Bruises lined the inside of her elbows and stretched along her forearms, far too many for the injections listed on the daily charts. Some were fresh, others fading into yellow stains under her pale skin. Elena had seen enough hospitals during her own heartbreak to know when something was excessive. Treatments could leave marks, yes, but not in this way. This was more than treatment. This was intrusion. Still, she said nothing. To speak without proof in a house ruled by money and grief would be reckless. Edward trusted only the doctors and specialists, not a maid who dusted his shelves. So Elena kept silent, but her silence carried weight. She started watching every detail more closely. At night, when the house sank into stillness, she sometimes lingered outside Isabella's room. That was when the whispers began. Isabella, half dreaming, spoke in words that chilled Elena more than the emptiness of the halls ever could. Not again. Please, not again. The words spilled out in a fragile, broken rhythm, as though Isabella was reliving something she could not escape. Sometimes her fingers clawed lightly at the sheets, her lips trembling in fear. Elena's hand would twitch toward the door, aching to comfort her. But she never entered. She only listened, and with each whisper, her suspicion grew sharper. This was not the voice of a woman losing strength to disease. This was the voice of someone under siege. Unable to carry the weight of silence any longer, Elena began journaling. She wrote down the times meals were served, the names of those who brought them, Isabella's reactions afterward. She noted the number and placement of bruises each time she helped change sheets or fold laundry near the bedside. She recorded the words Isabella muttered in her sleep, word for word, afraid that forgetting even a syllable might cost her the truth. Her journal became her secret weapon, a record that no one else in the mansion bothered to keep. The staff came and went with indifference, and Edward remained locked in his grief, blind to the shifting pieces around him. But Elena saw it. She saw it all, and for the first time, she realized that she might be the only one willing to piece it together. The Harrington estate had grown used to silence, But Elena understood something crucial. Silence could hide danger just as easily as it could hide grief. And the deeper she looked, the more convinced she became. Isabella's illness was not just an illness. It was something far more deliberate. Elena had learned long ago that trust was never gained through grand gestures. It was built in silence, in the small moments most people overlooked. In the Harrington mansion where silence ruled every corridor, those small moments became her only weapon. She began with the simplest act, offering tea. Not the strong brews the other staff prepared, but a gentle herbal mix she made herself. She would set the cup near Isabella's bedside and step back, never pushing her to drink. At first, Isabella ignored it, her eyes drifting past as though the world around her no longer mattered. But one evening, Elena returned to find the cup half empty. It was nothing more than a sip, but in that sip, Elena saw a glimmer of choice, a spark of will that had been absent for too long. Encouraged, she continued. She brought soft blankets warmed by the fireplace, brushed Isabella's thinning hair with delicate strokes, and read aloud in low tones from old novels left on the shelves. She never demanded conversation. She never asked questions. She simply stayed present, her presence quiet but steady. Days blurred into weeks, and little by little, Isabella responded. Sometimes her gaze lingered longer on Elena's face, as though searching for recognition. Other times, her hand twitched ever so slightly when Elena adjusted her pillows, almost like an unspoken thank you. It wasn't much, but to Elena, who knew the language of grief, it was everything. Edward noticed none of this. He remained buried in charts and reports, convinced that salvation would arrive through contracts and clinical trials. But Elena understood that Isabella's struggle wasn't only in her body, it was in her spirit, worn down by something no chart could explain. One night, as the house slept, Elena sat quietly in the chair beside Isabella's bed. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, shadows curling against the walls. Isabella shifted in her sleep, her face tightening as if reliving a memory too heavy to bear. Then her lips moved. "It's not sickness. It's someone here." The words were barely audible, a breath more than a voice, but they pierced the silence like glass breaking. Elena froze, her heart pounding. She leaned closer, but Isabella's eyes remained closed, her body sinking back into restless sleep. Elena sat motionless, replaying the words again and again in her mind. Not sickness. Someone here. It wasn't the kind of thing a woman drifting in illness would say by chance. It carried weight, a warning that sounded like the echo of truth. Isabella's whispers were not delirium, they were fragments of fear. In that moment, Elena felt the weight of responsibility shift onto her shoulders. She had come to this mansion seeking escape from her own pain, never intending to interfere in the life of the billionaire family that employed her. But Isabella's fragile trust had opened a door, and through that door, a secret seemed to be waiting. The next morning, Elena's eyes sharpened. She paid closer attention to every tray of food, every bottle of medicine, every person who entered Isabella's room. Her journal filled with new observations, times, names, reactions. She wrote down Isabella's whispered words, unwilling to let them fade into forgetfulness. The Harrington estate was drowning in grief, but beneath that grief, Elena was beginning to sense something else, a quiet war being waged against the woman everyone believed was dying naturally. Isabella's illness was not simply a cruel twist of fate. If her words were true, then the real danger was inside the house. And Elena, the maid who was supposed to be invisible, was now the only one who saw it. Elena's days became an exercise in vigilance. She continued her quiet acts of care for Isabella, but beneath her calm movements, her mind sharpened like a blade. The whispered words, "It's not sickness, it's someone here," never left her. They clung to her thoughts as she scrubbed marble floors, arranged flowers, or folded sheets. Every task was now a cover for what she was truly doing. Observing. The first sign of concrete evidence came from something most overlooked, Isabella's medication log. It was kept neatly in a binder, updated daily by the nursing staff. At first glance, it seemed thorough, filled with precise handwriting, initials, and timestamps. But Elena had lived through hospitals, had studied charts during long nights when her own child was fighting for life. And the more she looked, the more she noticed subtle inconsistencies. Some entries carried extra doses, written in with a slightly different pen stroke, almost forced onto the page. The same name appeared repeatedly alongside those questionable entries, Nurse Campbell. She was a woman in her early 40s, quiet but distant, with eyes that never lingered long on anyone. Whenever Edward asked questions, she gave clipped, technical answers, always respectful but never warm. And whenever Elena entered the room, Nurse Campbell seemed uneasy, as though wanting to avoid her gaze. Elena didn't confront her. She knew better than to tip her hand too soon. Instead, she began recording in her journal every time Campbell administered medication, and every time Isabella's health seemed to decline more sharply afterward. The pattern was undeniable. Still, suspicion was not proof. Elena needed something tangible, something that would speak louder than her word against a trained nurse in a billionaire's household. That proof came one stormy night. The house was quieter than usual. Even the guards at the gate seemed subdued under the pounding rain. Elena moved through the darkened halls with deliberate steps, her heart thrumming like a drum in her chest. She carried no lantern, only the faint glow of her phone tucked into her apron pocket. Her destination was the medicine cabinet in the restricted storage room. She had memorized the times when staff changed shifts, and this was the one window where no one would be near. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the door with a spare key she had quietly retrieved earlier in the week. The cabinet loomed against the wall, rows of bottles and vials gleaming under dim light. At first, everything appeared normal. Labels, prescriptions, boxes arranged in careful order. But as Elena scanned the shelves, her eyes landed on a small cluster of vials tucked behind standard medication boxes. Unlike the others, these had no hospital markings, no pharmacy seals, just plain glass with handwritten stickers. She lifted one carefully, her breath catching as she read the faded label, midazolam. A powerful sedative, not a cancer drug, not part of Isabella's prescribed treatment plan. Her hands tightened around the vial, her pulse quickening. This wasn't a clerical error. This was deliberate. Administered regularly, it would weaken Isabella's body, slow her mind, and mimic the progression of illness. It explained the sudden dips after meals, the fog in her eyes, the whispers in her sleep. The air in the room seemed heavier as Elena slipped the vial into her apron pocket. Every instinct told her to leave quickly, but her feet felt frozen. Because in that moment, one truth became undeniable. Isabella wasn't just sick. She was being drugged. And now Elena held the first piece of proof in her hands, proof that could expose everything, but also put her in grave danger. The vial burned like a secret in Elena's apron pocket. For days she rehearsed the words she wanted to say, turning them over in her mind until she gathered the courage to approach Edward Harrington himself. She found him in his study, hunched over a desk stacked with medical reports and investment summaries he barely read anymore. His once commanding presence had shrunk, the sharp edges of his voice dulled by grief. But when Elena stepped into the room, her heart thundering, he still radiated the power of a man used to control. "Mr. Harrington," she began softly, "I need to speak to you about Isabella's treatment." He barely looked up. "If it's about her care, the doctors and nurses are handling it. You should speak with them." Elena swallowed hard. "That's just it. Something isn't right. The medication logs don't match, and I found vials, sedatives, not cancer treatments, being administered to her. She's not getting the care she should. Someone is hurting her, not helping her." The words hung heavy in the air. Edward's eyes finally rose, but instead of relief or alarm, they held disbelief. He leaned back, his expression tightening. "You're a maid," he said flatly. "You dust shelves, you sweep floors. You are not a doctor. You are not a nurse. Do you realize the weight of the accusation you're making?" Elena stood straighter, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I know what I saw. I've lived in hospitals. I've lost someone. And what's happening to Isabella doesn't match what the doctors claim. Please, look for yourself. If I'm wrong, then I'll accept whatever comes. But if I'm right..." Her voice broke. "If I'm right, then she's being poisoned under your own roof." Edward's face hardened. He closed the report in front of him with finality. "Grief makes people see things that aren't there. You've carried your own pain here, and it clouds your judgment. I cannot indulge paranoia, not when Isabella's life hangs in the balance. Leave this matter to the professionals." Dismissed. Just like that. Elena's chest ached as she walked back into the hall. She expected anger, but what she felt was worse, the cold sting of dismissal. Billionaire walls were built not only from stone and wealth, but from mistrust of those deemed beneath them. To Edward, her voice meant nothing, not compared to the white coats and glossy charts that surrounded him. The staff, however, had noticed her attempts. That evening, as she carried linens down the corridor, one of the older housemaids intercepted her. The woman's tone was sharp, her eyes filled with warning. "You'd better mind your place," she hissed. "This house doesn't reward questions, it punishes them. Keep your head down if you want to stay." Others echoed the same sentiment in whispers. "Stay quiet, do your job, don't make trouble." To them, she was a servant meddling in matters far above her station. But Alina had seen too much to retreat now. She returned to her small room, pulled out her journal, and wrote with furious determination. If Edward wouldn't listen, if the staff warned her to be silent, then she would carry the truth herself. The Harrington mansion was drowning in grief and denial. But somewhere within its gilded walls, someone was orchestrating Isabella's slow destruction. And Elena, the maid nobody valued, was the only one willing to uncover it. The warning to mind her place only fueled Alina's determination. If no one in the Harrington household would believe her, then she would collect the kind of proof even a billionaire couldn't ignore. She began moving with greater purpose, slipping through hallways unnoticed, ears tuned for scraps of information that others dismissed. One evening, while carrying fresh linens toward the West Wing, Elena paused outside the study, where the head nurse often met with Edward's advisors. The door was slightly ajar, and voices drifted into the hall. She recognized the sharp tone of Nurse Campbell, controlled, clipped, with none of the warmth expected of someone caring for a dying woman. "We can't keep stretching this out," Campbell whispered urgently. "The dosage needs to stay consistent, or suspicion will rise." A second voice responded, deep and familiar. Elena's stomach tightened as she recognized it. Victor Harrington, Edward's younger brother. Unlike Edward, Victor had never built anything. He lingered in his brother's shadow, spending freely from allowances and investments Edward had granted him. To most, he was charming and harmless, a man content with wealth he hadn't earned. But in that moment, his tone was cold. "She has to stay weak," Victor said firmly. "The longer this goes, the easier it is to justify. Edward won't see it, he's too consumed. When the end comes, it will look natural. No questions asked." Elena's heart pounded so loudly she feared they would hear it in the hall. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, as Campbell replied, "Your brother keeps hiring new specialists. It's getting harder to control the narrative. If one of them insists on running deeper tests," Victor cut her off, "then we replace them, just like the others. You'll make sure of it. Do your part, and when this is over, you'll be taken care of. Generously." The room went quiet, but the silence only made the truth louder in Elena's mind. Isabella's decline wasn't fate, it was design. Victor stood to gain everything if Isabella died. Though Edward's empire was vast, large portions of assets and shares were structured in ways that shifted depending on family status. With Isabella gone, Victor's influence would multiply overnight, giving him access to holdings he could never touch while she lived. He wasn't waiting for tragedy. He was engineering it. Elena gripped the linen so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had suspected foul play, but to hear it spoken so plainly, so coldly, was more chilling than anything she imagined. Isabella's suffering wasn't just ignored, it was being orchestrated for profit. She slipped away before the meeting ended, her steps silent against the carpet. In her room, she opened her journal and wrote furiously, recording every word she remembered. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed heavily on her chest. This wasn't just about Isabella anymore. This was about power, inheritance, and a brother willing to sacrifice family for fortune. For the first time, fear truly took hold of her. Victor Harrington wasn't just greedy, he was dangerous. And now, if anyone discovered she had overheard that conversation, Elena knew she wouldn't be safe. Still, she refused to turn away. Isabella's faint whispers echoed in her mind. "It's not sickness. It's someone here." Now Elena knew exactly who that someone was. But knowledge without proof was fragile. If Edward was blind before, confronting him now with nothing more than her word would only deepen his mistrust. She needed evidence. Something undeniable, something that would cut through the fortress of wealth and lies surrounding Isabella's bed. And as Elena stared at her journal, a plan began to form. She would watch closer, dig deeper, and risk everything. Because in this house of power and silence, truth had become the most dangerous currency of all. The decline came suddenly, sharper than before. Isabella's breaths turned shallow, her eyes fluttered half shut, and her body seemed to sink deeper into the mattress as though the bed itself was pulling her away. Even Edward, blind to so much, could see the truth written across her face. Days, not weeks, remained. Doctors offered no new answers. They spoke of end stages, of keeping her comfortable. Edward clenched his jaw and signed more checks. But even he could no longer disguise the despair creeping into his voice. The Harrington mansion felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for death. Elena, however, refused to accept what everyone else had declared inevitable. She had watched too closely, listened too carefully, to believe Isabella's body was simply surrendering to illness. If anything, the pace of her decline confirmed what she already knew. Someone was accelerating it. And then the moment came. Late one evening, Elena lingered in the hallway outside Isabella's room. The door stood slightly ajar, the lamplight spilling into the corridor. Inside, Nurse Campbell leaned over the bed, syringe in hand. Isabella stirred weakly, her lips forming silent protests. Elena's breath caught as she recognized the label on the vial, the same sedative she had found hidden in the storage cabinet. Her heart thundered. She pulled her phone from her apron, thumb trembling as she pressed record. Through the narrow gap, the lens captured everything. Campbell sliding the needle into Isabella's arm, the faint hiss of liquid pushed through, the woman's cold efficiency as she disposed of the syringe. It was the proof Elena had risked everything to find, but proof alone meant little if it remained buried in her pocket. She knew she couldn't trust the staff. She couldn't trust the advisors. There was only one person whose belief could change the course of this nightmare: Edward Harrington himself. That night, when the house sank into its usual silence, Elena crept into Edward's office. Papers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, reports that had failed to save his wife. She placed her phone beside them, her hand hovering over the screen to cue the recording. "Just one look," she whispered to herself. "That's all it will take." But before she could press play, the heavy door swung open. Edward stood in the threshold, his face shadowed by the dim light, his eyes narrowed as they landed on her. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was low, dangerous. Elena turned, her pulse racing. "Mr. Harrington, please, you need to see this." His gaze darkened. "You went through my office? After everything, after I told you to stop meddling." "It's not meddling," she burst out, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. She lifted the phone with both hands. "It's Isabella. You need to see what they're doing to her." Edward's fists clenched at his sides. "Enough, Elena. You've let grief twist your imagination. If you speak another word." She pressed play. The room filled with the quiet but undeniable images. Nurse Campbell injecting Isabella, the vial unmistakably labeled, the limp weakness that followed in its wake. No explanation could twist what the video showed. Edward's voice faltered. His anger collapsed into silence as he leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. For the first time, the billionaire who had dismissed her words was forced to confront evidence that money could not erase. When the recording ended, the office seemed to shake with the weight of truth. Edward's face was ashen, his lips parting without words. He looked at Elena, not as a servant, but as the only person who had dared to see what he had refused to believe. The empire he had built was suddenly meaningless, because in that moment, Edward realized his wife was not dying of sickness. She was being killed.